Welcome to you this Good Friday of 2021, the second Good Friday that we will be remembering under lockdown restrictions. We will be spending 60 minutes at the foot of the cross, an hour as we walk with Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane through his trial and crucifixion until his death and laying in the tomb. This is brought to you from St Peter's Glenfield and All Saints Newtown Linford. We pray that as you hear John Woolmer speak, 6 short talks and reflections, as you join in song, as you rest, that you will find this a perfect entry into the Easter Sunday that awaits us. As we approach 3 p.m, the time when Jesus breathed his last and gave up his spirit to his Father, there will be a minute of silence. And then we go in peace. God bless you.
We begin our Good Friday reflection by reading what, for Christians, is probably the most important passage in the Old Testament. We're reading part of Isaiah chapter 53. This is about the prophetic suffering servant. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we were healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. And he made his grave with the wicked, his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. It seems obvious that Isaiah is looking forward to a servant of God who will suffer grievously and unjustly. The servant will be despised and rejected. He will be silent before his accusers. He will be led like a sheep to be slaughtered. And yet, amazingly, he will have a tomb with the rich. In the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, the eunuch is reading this passage aloud when Philip appears out of nowhere to talk to him. The eunuch asks the crucial question, about whom does the prophet say this? About himself or somebody else? And Philip was able to explain to him about Jesus, and soon the eunuch is asking for baptism. The Ethiopian church likes to trace its origins back to this event. The Old Testament was crucial to the early church, especially in their conversations with people of the Jewish race. Psalm 22 was another source of many prophetic statements, including Jesus' cry, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" and the casting of lots and the mockery of the onlookers, and his terrible thirst. And Peter used this passage in his first epistle. I always feel that the Old Testament is like a wonderful jigsaw puzzle, giving us an amazing picture of God, with a cross-shaped piece missing. And to fully understand the cross, we need to carefully consider both Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. And now, after some silence and some music, we can move on into the New Testament. For our second talk, we move into the Garden of Gethsemane. This is part of Luke's account from chapter 22. Jesus came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he'd reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then Jesus withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and prayed. "Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. And in his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. And when he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray, that you may not come into the time of trial." And while he was speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. The garden is an important track beside an important track which leaves Jerusalem and heads south from the Kidron Valley and then up the steep slope which leads towards the Mount of Olives. At the top of the path, you can turn east towards the village of Bethany. And here, Jesus retires to pray. It is a long, hard hour of prayer. What is the Father's will? Could Jesus take the safe way out and continue on the track from Jerusalem and reach the safety of his friends in Bethany? "Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Usually Jesus had prayed with complete confidence for healing, for deliverance against a fruitless fig tree or a storm on a lake. Here his prayer is less certain. In the past he has several times avoided disaster because his hour had not yet come. Now he has a choice. He can melt away from Jerusalem and danger and make his way home via his friends higher up the ridge in Bethany. Alternatively, he can stay and allow himself to be handed over to the hostile authorities. Somehow, he knows that this is the appointed time for him to drink the cup of God's wrath and to begin the process of atoning for the sin of the world. These are his last moments of freedom. Up till now, he has been the complete master of every circumstance and all situations, whether it was a hostile congregation in Nazareth, a fearsome storm on the Lake of Galilee, or whatever healing or exorcism situation he was confronted with. Humanly, he had a real choice. He could easily leave the garden and find his friends in Bethany. But Luke tells us that his sweat was red like blood, and that an angel comforted him, and eventually he got up, the decision made. The text about the angel and the sweat is not in all manuscripts. However, I think we should accept it. It's far more likely that some pious scribe deleted it from some copies, as it seemed to show weakness on the part of Jesus, rather than someone should think up and add such a strange event. Anyway, Jesus gently rebuked his sleeping disciples and waited to be handed over to the Jewish authorities. Very quickly, Judas arrived. The disciples resisted briefly, and as Jesus had prophesied, they then scattered. And only in Mark's Gospel we are told that a young man, almost captured by the soldiers, lost his clothing and fled away naked. As Mark lived in Jerusalem, we may safely presume that this is his personal testimony. This is a valuable additional bit of information which adds authenticity to the whole dramatic scene. Our third talk tells us about the faithful women who followed Jesus to the cross and watched his terrible fate. Reading first from Luke chapter 23. And they led Jesus away, and they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people following him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. And they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? Luke seems to have had a very high regard for the women around Jesus. He tells us far more about them than any of the other writers. Jesus was followed by a great crowd of unhappy people, who were clearly making a great commotion. Whatever the earlier hostile crowd may have cried, Jesus was not without support. When the earlier crowd shouted for his crucifixion, here the women are wailing because of his fate. And Jesus turns and gives them a very solemn warning. And these words presumably refer to the destruction of the Holy City 40 years later in AD 70, which Jesus had already prophesied. The meaning of the last verse, when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry, is not entirely clear, but perhaps it means that if the Romans are going to treat someone who they knew to be innocent in this terrible way, how much worse will be the treatment of the guilty rebels when the city falls. It's clear that the women faithfully watched the proceedings. The 12, now 11, with the honourable exception of John, seem to have been conspicuous by their absence. And for most people, the words of Jeremiah were all too true. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? But the women, overcome with grief and apprehension, were loyal and brave. Sadly, those words of Jeremiah are all too true today. For most people, Good Friday is a public holiday, but the significance of it lies hidden. We need to pray that people should know and have their eyes opened to the truth. And then we read from John's Gospel toward the end of the whole drama, from John 19. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his own home. Even in the terrible extremities of a cruel death, Jesus still shows concern for others. The faithful John had brought his mother to Golgotha. They must have come very close, and Jesus outlines a future for them. Mary, years earlier, had heard the prophecy of Simeon, and a sword will pierce through your soul also. And now her son exercises great compassion and does something that will do much to ease the pain. This is the last but one reference to Mary in the Gospels. The final one sees her at prayer with the disciples and her other children on the day of the Ascension. And tradition tells us that John and Mary eventually lived in Ephesus, where John wrote his Gospel and letters. Finally, we read a verse from Mark. This is after Jesus' death, and Mark records, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, saw where the body was laid. And it is good that some of the faithful women, including Mary Magdalene, were watching to see what would happen. They could bring the burial spices after the Sabbath was over. Meanwhile, there was a long wait for everyone. Jesus' earthly journey was over, and what could lie ahead? Our fourth talk is about some of the men whose lives were transformed by this day. While for most of Jerusalem, Jeremiah's haunting words, "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by," would apply, there were at least 5 men who would never have the same attitude to life. First was Simon of Cyrene, coming in from a far country, now Libya, for the feast. He was presumably coming into Jerusalem down the narrow street which we now call the Via Dolorosa, when he met the crowd of Roman soldiers and 3 prisoners and the wailing women travelling in the opposite direction. Jesus probably stumbled. The soldiers, not wishing to lose their man before they reached the place of execution, seized or impressed Simon. He was doubtless bewailing his bad luck as he carried the heavy cross some distance to Golgotha. We don't know how it happened. It may have been a word that Jesus said to him. It may have been that he stayed on to watch. It may have been that one of Jesus' friends spoke to him. What we do know is he became a follower of Jesus. Mark actually takes us the trouble to tell us the names of his children, Alexander and Rufus, who must have been known in the Church of Rome, where Mark wrote his epistle. And Paul, in his epistle to the Romans, even greets a Rufus, who may well be the same person, whom he calls eminent in the Lord. And he also mentions his mother as another Christian and someone who'd actually helped Paul. And then Luke takes up the story with the well-known story of the 2 criminals. And one of the criminals who were hanged with there kept deriding Jesus and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him. "Do you not fear God, since you're under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been justly condemned, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly, I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise." The second man's spiritual eyes were opened. And not only did he stop insulting Jesus, which according to Mark he'd certainly begun by doing, but he recognized not only Jesus' innocence, but also that Jesus had a future. In a real sense, he was the first person to recognize how this apparent tragedy was going to end. Jesus' reply is truly wonderful and very important. "Truly I say to you, today you'll be with me in paradise." The number of key words, truly, Amen, literally Amen, translated over and over again in the Authorized Version by the word verily. Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, begins with a word which underlines the truthfulness of what he's saying. These are not idle words of comfort. These are words which can help each of us when we face our last moments on earth. The second key word is today. Jesus is not offering a distant future. He's proclaiming an instantaneous change of circumstances. We may not understand how all this will work out, but I think we may safely assume that while our earthly body or ashes may deteriorate in a grave, our spirit, clothed in a new body, will arrive in paradise. The penitent thief had probably committed many crimes, but that didn't mean that he could never be forgiven. I wonder if any of us think we've done something too awful ever to obtain forgiveness. This story should assure us that Jesus can and will forgive any situation if we will turn to him. For our fifth talk, we consider the whole question of suffering. Reading from John chapter 19. After this, that's after Jesus had arranged for his mother to be with John. When Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the wine, he said, It is finished. Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Jesus had suffered in many ways. The appalling physical suffering is obvious, but he also had to endure terrible mockery. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. He had to endure the pain of betrayal, desertion, and denial by the people he'd spent 3 years training and looking after. And add to that the spiritual agony of indecision in the garden and the emotional agony of seeing the suffering of his mother. We can assuredly say that no one remotely suffered as he did. We live in a world full of suffering. Apart from the ravages of COVID, many countries and groups of people suffer greatly. And quite naturally, people tend to ask, where's God? And it is one of the main reasons people give for not believing. Good Friday offers us 2 answers in a way that no other faiths or philosophies can. First, Jesus bore his suffering with extraordinary courage. He even found a way in the midst of it to help and encourage others. And I've known some believers who've borne suffering with great courage and in their turmoil have been an inspiration to others. And if we knew nothing of Jesus' teaching and nothing of his miracles, nothing of his life, and we only had an account of his death, we would know that we were in the hands of a truly remarkable man. But secondly, Jesus' suffering had a purpose, in some way that we can never fully understand. He fulfilled the role of Isaiah's suffering servant, bearing our sins and griefs and setting us free. Of course, this only makes sense in the light of Easter. We can admire Jesus' suffering, but it is only the Easter faith which shows us that it is also a way to deal with our own suffering. In the light of Easter, we can truly believe that God has shown us that all our griefs, though very real, are transitory, and that Jesus can truly bear them for us. And that the Easter faith means that light triumphs over darkness, that joy breaks through over and overcomes all grief, and that our broken lives have an eternal purpose. For the many, those who I've said fulfill Jeremiah's sad words, is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? For the many, there is actually no answer to the problem of suffering. It's just an inevitable part of life's weary pilgrimage. But for those of us with the gift of faith, although suffering is still very real and very intense, and in many parts of the world for believers seems to be greatly increasing, it is manageable, for there is hope. And we can only thank our Lord Jesus Christ, who, as Paul said in the second letter to the Corinthians, for our sake God made him sin who knew no sin, so that him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus came to bring us life. And that life and that hope is what should, for us, make suffering bearable. Our final talk is about forgiveness. Luke's account of the whole event begins with Jesus' amazing statement, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And 3 of the 7 sayings from the cross are associated with forgiveness. This general saying should absolve everyone, and in particular the Jewish nation, from guilt. Wrong had been done, injustice had been perpetrated, but all this was forgivable, if only people would seek it. We've just thought about the penitent thief. He certainly needed forgiveness. We don't know exactly what his crimes were. However, by acknowledging his guilt, he'd moved a long way towards receiving forgiveness, and his robust defense of Jesus and belief in the future completed a remarkable change. The third saying is far more elusive, reading from Mark chapter 15, from verse 34. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This terrifying cry, coming after 3 hours of supernatural darkness, is a quotation from the first verse of Psalm 22, which has many other prophetic references to these events. It is not a cry of weakness. All the New Testament writers understood this. As I said at the end of the last talk, Paul wrote at the end of 2 Corinthians 5, "For our sake God made him sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." This was the final act of the drama which began in Gethsemane and continued with the trials and the punishments. And here, Jesus is temporally in darkness, seemingly cut off from the Father, bearing the weight of all our sin. He'd suffered the agony of the garden, the awfulness of betrayal, the injustice of false trials, the fearsome punishments of Roman justice, and now the terrifying sense of God's absence. But the cry was almost the end. John tells us that he summoned up his strength to cry out, "It is finished," or "It is accomplished," not in resignation, but in glorious completion. These sayings tell us indeed that we have the most remarkable man and the most remarkable death. And St. John witnessed the strangely symbolic flow of blood and water after a soldier thrust a spear into Jesus' body to prove that he had died. An extraordinary birth opened the way for an extraordinary life. An extraordinary death opened the way for something yet more wonderful. And there were at least 3 men profoundly affected. The first was the centurion, who is variously recorded by Luke saying certainly this man was innocent, and by Mark and Matthew as truly this man was God's son. The centurion would have supervised many executions. It was a routine day's work for him. But he noticed something different. How it affected him in the long term, we can't know. But the onlookers must have heard his surprising conclusion, and they would have treasured it. Then, after he died, came the burial. Mark tells us that Joseph of Arimathea did something incredibly brave and significant. He was a prominent man, a secret believer, John tells us, and with his friend Nicodemus in John's Gospel, they buried Jesus in Joseph's new cut grave. First, he had to get permission from Pilate, who, after checking that Jesus was really dead, agreed. And it's extraordinary how many people had life-changing encounters on this day. Simon of Cyrene, the thief, the centurion, and now these 2 leading citizens. Unknowingly, Joseph was fulfilling Isaiah 53 verse 9, where it says the suffering servant would have his tomb with the rich. The famous French philosopher Pascal wrote that prophecies are the greatest proof of Jesus Christ. Anyway, be that as it may, the wonderful tomb set the stage for the wonderful event that was to follow. Otherwise, Jesus' body would have been thrown into a common pit. The resurrection would still have taken place, but the evidence would have been less convincing. And we can be grateful to Joseph and Nicodemus, and to Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, who'd stayed behind and saw what had happened. It's fitting that our journey, which began in the quiet Garden of Gethsemane, should end with this quiet burial. It is wonderful that some of the faithful women were watching to see what would happen. They could bring burial spices after the Sabbath was over. Meanwhile, there was a long wait for everyone. Jesus' earthly life was finished, accomplished. But what could lie ahead?